The old horse stood between Rebecca and her uncle's raised fist, something wild burning in his clouded eyes. For 16 years, that girl had known nothing but bruises and fear. But today, Dusty would remind everyone what happens when you corner something with nothing left to lose. Rebecca pressed her back against the barn wall, her Uncle Silas towering over her with bourbon on his breath and rage in his bloodshot eyes. The morning chores weren't done fast enough. The eggs weren't collected properly. Always something wrong, always something to punish. "You worthless little burden," Silas snarled, his calloused hand clenched into a weapon. "Should have sent you to the workhouse when your parents died." Rebecca's ribs still ached from yesterday's beating. Her left arm hung stiff where he'd twisted it behind her back until something popped. She'd learned not to cry anymore. Tears only made him angrier. But Dusty had been watching from his stall. The 20-year-old stallion, once powerful and proud, now moved with the careful steps of old age. His coat had lost its shine, his mane had gone gray, and most folks assumed he was ready for the glue factory. Silas raised his hand higher, and Rebecca flinched, closing her eyes tight. She thought about her parents' faces, tried to remember her mother's voice singing lullabies. Anything to escape what was coming. That's when she heard it, the sound of heavy hooves stepping out of the stall. Silas turned, his drunken sneer faltering as Dusty moved between them. The horse's head lowered, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. Something had shifted in the old stallion's posture, something dangerous. "Get back, you old nag," Silas spat, but his voice carried less conviction now. Dusty didn't budge. If anything, he stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over the man who'd terrorized Rebecca for 3 long years. The horse's eyes had gone dark, focused with an intensity that made even Silas pause. Rebecca opened her eyes, hardly believing what she saw. This gentle creature, who let her brush his mane and whisper her secrets into his ear. He was standing up to the monster she'd never been able to face. But Silas wasn't backing down. Not yet. He reached for the riding crop hanging on the wall, his face twisted with the kind of fury that promised someone would pay dearly. And what happened next would change everything Rebecca thought she knew about courage. The riding crop whistled through the air, but it never found its target. Dusty reared up on his hind legs, front hooves pawing the air inches from Silas's face. The man stumbled backward, dropping the crop as 20 years of horse training told him to get out of the way. "What the hell?" Silas gasped, scrambling against the barn door. Rebecca had never seen Dusty like this. The old horse she'd known was gentle, patient, letting her lean against his warm neck when the loneliness became too much. But this was different. This was the stallion he'd once been, when cowboys feared his kick and respected his power. Dusty landed hard, his hooves striking the wooden floor with authority. He snorted once, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls. Then he did something that made Rebecca's heart skip. He turned his head and looked at her as if to say, "Get ready to run." Silas wiped sweat from his forehead, his hands shaking with rage and something else. "Fear. You think that old horse scares me? I'll put a bullet in his head and sell him for dog meat." But as he reached for the shotgun mounted on the wall, Dusty charged. Not a full gallop. The old horse's joints wouldn't allow that anymore. But a determined, purposeful advance that sent Silas diving behind a hay bale, cursing and shouting threats that sounded increasingly hollow. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, watching in amazement as this creature she'd nursed through countless quiet evenings finally showed the world what lived beneath his weathered hide. Every muscle in Dusty's body was taut, every instinct focused on the man who'd brought so much pain into their shared world of silence and suffering. "I'll call the sheriff," Silas hollered from behind his hiding spot. "That horse is dangerous. They'll put him down." The words hit Rebecca like ice water. She'd found the one living thing that cared about her, and now Silas would destroy him too. Just like he destroyed her hope, her spirit, her belief that anyone would ever protect her. Dusty must have sensed her fear because he stopped his advance and turned toward her again. In his eyes she saw something that made her chest tight with emotion. Not just protection, but understanding. This old horse knew exactly what it meant to be powerless, to be overlooked, to be considered worthless by people who should know better. But Silas was already moving toward the door, muttering about rifles and dog catchers and putting down dangerous animals. And Rebecca realized with growing horror that saving her might have just signed Dusty's death warrant. Rebecca watched Silas storm toward the house, his boots crunching on gravel as he shouted threats over his shoulder. She knew that walk. Purposeful, deadly. He was going for the rifle he kept loaded above the fireplace, the one he'd threatened her with more times than she could count. "Easy, boy," she whispered, reaching toward Dusty with trembling fingers. The old horse lowered his head, letting her touch his neck. His coat was damp with sweat, his breathing still heavy from the confrontation, but his eyes had softened when they met hers. She thought about running, taking Dusty and disappearing into the hills before Silas returned. But where could a 16-year-old girl and an aging horse go? She had no money, no family, nowhere to turn. The nearest town was 20 miles through rough country, and Silas would hunt them down long before they reached help. Through the window, she could see him in the house, yanking open drawers and slamming cabinet doors, searching for something. Her stomach dropped when she realized what: the papers that made him her legal guardian. He'd wave them at anyone who questioned his right to do whatever he wanted with his property, including her. Dusty nuzzled her shoulder, and she buried her face in his mane. He smelled like hay and dust, and something indefinably comforting that reminded her of better times. Before her parents died in that wagon accident. Before she'd been dumped on Silas's doorstep like an unwanted package. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his ear. "You shouldn't have protected me. Now he'll hurt you too." But even as she said it, she felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in 3 years, someone had stood up for her. Someone had seen her worth protecting, even if that someone had 4 legs and a graying mane. Silas burst back through the barn door, rifle in hand, his face flushed with alcohol and fury. "Get away from that animal, Rebecca! It's gone mad!" She didn't move, couldn't move, because she'd just realized something that changed everything. She'd rather die standing next to the one creature that cared about her than live another day cowering in fear. "I said get away!" Silas raised the rifle, pointing it directly at Dusty's head. The old horse didn't flinch. If anything, he stepped closer to Rebecca, shielding her with his body. His message was clear. If Silas wanted to hurt her, he'd have to go through him first. And that's when Rebecca heard the sound that made her blood freeze. The distinctive click of a rifle being cocked, ready to fire. But what happened next would prove that some bonds run deeper than fear, and some courage grows strongest in the darkest moments. "No!" Rebecca stepped in front of Dusty, her arms spread wide. The rifle barrel was now pointed directly at her chest. But something had broken loose inside her. 3 years of beatings, of silence, of accepting that she deserved every blow. It all crumbled in that moment. Silas blinked, momentarily confused by her defiance. "Move, Rebecca. That horse attacked me. It's dangerous." "You're the dangerous one," she said, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. "You're the one who hurts things smaller than you, who beats a child because your own life is so miserable." The rifle wavered slightly in Silas's hands. He wasn't used to her fighting back, wasn't prepared for the girl who'd learned to take punishment in silence to suddenly find her voice. Behind her, Dusty remained perfectly still, but she could feel his warmth against her back. His presence gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. If you were Rebecca, what would you do? Stand your ground and risk everything for the one friend you've ever had, or step aside and watch him die to save yourself? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Rebecca decided next would determine both their fates. "You think I won't shoot through you to get to that animal?" Silas snarled, but his hands were shaking now, whether from rage or fear or the bourbon she couldn't tell. "I think you're a coward," Rebecca said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I think you beat me because I remind you of how pathetic you are, because even a 16-year-old girl sees through your act." Silas's face went purple with rage. "You ungrateful little." That's when Dusty moved. Not a charge this time, but something more calculated. He stepped sideways, putting himself between Rebecca and the rifle again, but now he was close enough to Silas that one swift kick could end everything. The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Silas with his rifle, Rebecca with her newfound courage, and Dusty with the patient wisdom of an animal who'd survived 20 hard years by knowing exactly when to strike. "You can't watch me every second," Silas said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "When you sleep, when you eat, when you think you're safe, I'll be waiting. And when I'm done with you both, nobody will even remember you existed." But he was backing toward the door as he spoke, and Rebecca realized something that sent hope flooding through her veins. He was afraid, truly afraid, of her, of Dusty, of what they might do together. The rifle was still pointed at them, But Silas was retreating, step by careful step. And then they heard it, the sound of horses approaching fast, their hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. Multiple riders, moving with purpose toward the ranch. Silas froze, his head turning toward the sound. Who the hell? But Rebecca was already smiling, because she'd recognized something in that approaching rhythm that Silas had missed. Something that would change everything they thought they knew about rescue. The riders weren't coming to rescue her. Rebecca's heart sank as she recognized the voices calling out to Silas, his drinking buddies from town, the ones who visited on weekends to play cards and share stories about putting uppity women and animals in their place. "Silas, we heard shooting," called out Thorn Mallet, sliding off his horse with practiced ease. Behind him came Wade Harper and Ezra Briggs, 3 men cut from the same bitter cloth as her uncle. Silas lowered his rifle slightly, relief washing over his face. "Perfect timing, boys. This horse went crazy. Attacked me. And Rebecca here's been filling its head with ideas." Rebecca felt Dusty tense behind her. The old horse understood danger in numbers, understood that 3 more men meant 3 times the threat. But he didn't back down. If anything, he seemed to gather himself, preparing for whatever came next. "That old nag?" Wade laughed, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Hell, Silas should have put him down years ago. Save on feed money. Girl's gotten too big for her britches, too," Ezra added, his small eyes settling on Rebecca with the kind of look that made her skin crawl. "Maybe needs a lesson in respect." Silas straightened, emboldened by his audience. "Been thinking the same thing. Rebecca's 16 now, old enough to learn how the world really works." The way he said it, the way all 4 men were looking at her now, made Rebecca's blood turn to ice. She'd always known this day would come, when Silas decided she was old enough for different kinds of punishment, when his friends started seeing her as something other than just a troublesome child. "Please," she whispered, but the word came out broken, desperate. Dusty must have heard something in her voice, because he turned his head and nickered softly. The same sound he'd made when she'd first found him neglected in his stall, the sound that said, "I'm here, you're not alone." 4 against 1 horse and a girl, Thorne said, checking his pistol. "Hardly seems fair." "For the horse," Wade added, and all 4 men laughed. But Rebecca wasn't listening to their threats anymore. She was remembering something her father had told her before he died. Something about how the strongest horses weren't always the biggest or fastest, but the ones who refused to quit, the ones who found strength in protecting what mattered most. Dusty was 20 years old, past his prime, with joints that ached, and a body that had seen too many hard winters. But as the 4 men spread out around them, something ancient and wild stirred in his eyes. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. And Rebecca realized that they'd all made the same mistake. They'd looked at an old horse and a frightened girl and seen easy victims. But what they were about to discover would teach them that the most dangerous creatures are the ones with nothing left to lose. Dusty exploded into motion with a speed that defied his age. 20 years of contained power erupted as he reared up, his hooves catching Thorne across the shoulder and sending him sprawling into the dirt. The man's pistol went flying, skittering across the barn floor. "Jesus!" Wade scrambled backward, pulling his own gun, but Dusty was already wheeling around, his massive hindquarters swinging toward Ezra with bone-crushing force. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, watching in amazement as the gentle horse she'd known transformed into something primal and terrifying. This wasn't random violence. Every kick was calculated, every charge deliberate. Dusty was fighting like he'd done this before, like some deep instinct was guiding his movements. Ezra dove behind a water trough, just as Dusty's hoof splintered the wood where his head had been. "Shoot it! Shoot the damn thing!" But the barn had become chaos. The other horses were screaming in their stalls, kicking at their doors. Chickens scattered in every direction, adding their panic to the din. And in the center of it all, Dusty moved like a force of nature, keeping all 4 men at bay. Silas raised his rifle again, trying to get a clear shot, but Dusty seemed to sense the threat. He charged straight at Silas, forcing the man to dive aside. The rifle discharged into the ceiling, raining splinters down on everyone. "The girl!" Wade shouted over the noise. "Grab the girl!" Rebecca's blood froze as she realized their strategy. They couldn't get past Dusty while she was behind him, but if they took her hostage, the old horse would have to choose between protecting her and defending himself. Thorne was back on his feet, blood streaming from his shoulder, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "I'm gonna enjoy breaking you both," he snarled, lunging toward Rebecca. Dusty spun around, but this time he wasn't fast enough. Age and exertion were taking their toll. Thorn's hand closed around Rebecca's wrist, yanking her away from the horse's protection. "Got her!" Thorn shouted triumphantly, dragging Rebecca toward the barn door. "Now what's your move, old nag?" Dusty froze, his intelligent eyes taking in the new situation. Rebecca in enemy hands, 4 armed men between him and her, nowhere to run. For a moment, the fight seemed to drain out of him. His head lowered, sides heaving with exhaustion. "That's right," Silas said, raising his rifle once more. "Game over." But Rebecca wasn't done fighting. The courage Dusty had given her, the strength she'd found in being protected for the first time in her life, it was still burning inside her. Thorn's grip was tight, but his wounded shoulder made him vulnerable. She bit down hard on his hand, tasting blood, and when he yelped and loosened his grip, she twisted free and ran back toward Dusty. "You little—" Thorn roared, raising his fist to strike her down. That's when Dusty did something that would be talked about for years to come. Something that proved courage isn't about size or strength, but about the depth of love that drives you to protect what matters most. Dusty launched himself through the air in a leap that seemed impossible for a horse his age. Not at Thorn, but over Rebecca, his body creating a living shield between her and the 4 men. He landed hard, his legs trembling with the impact, but he stood firm. Then he did something none of them expected. He began to back toward the barn door, nudging Rebecca with his shoulder, guiding her step by step toward the outside. Not retreating in fear, but executing a plan. "Where do you think you're going?" Silas demanded, following with his rifle raised. Nowhere to run out there but open country. But as they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, Rebecca understood what Dusty had been doing. The other ranch horses, spooked by the commotion, had broken free from the corral. They stood scattered across the yard, nervous and agitated, looking to the old stallion for guidance. Dusty lifted his head and let out a sound Rebecca had never heard before. A wild, commanding call that seemed to reach something ancient in every horse within hearing. It was the voice of a leader, a protector, a force that wouldn't be tamed or broken. The response was immediate. 8 horses began moving toward them, not in panic, but with purpose. Their ears were pinned back, their eyes focused on the 4 men who'd brought violence to their sanctuary. "What in hell?" Wade gasped, backing against the barn wall as the horses formed a semicircle around Dusty and Rebecca. Thorn raised his pistol, but his wounded shoulder made his aim unsteady. "They're just horses! Shoot them!" But Ezra was already running for his mount, and Wade wasn't far behind. They'd faced down men in bar rooms and bullied women and children. But this was something beyond their understanding. This was nature itself rising up against them. Silas stood his ground, rage overriding his fear. "I'll kill every last one of them, starting with that old nag." He aimed the rifle directly at Dusty's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. Rebecca closed her eyes, unable to watch the creature who'd saved her life meet such a brutal end. The shot rang out across the yard, echoing off the mountains. But when Rebecca opened her eyes, Dusty was still standing. Silas lay crumpled in the dirt, the rifle knocked from his hands by a kick from Dusty's companion, a younger mare who'd circled behind him during the chaos. The old stallion walked slowly over to where Silas lay groaning in the dust. For a moment, he simply looked down at the man who'd brought so much pain to his world. Then he did something that showed mercy where none had been given. He turned away, and Rebecca knew that the nightmare that had defined her life for 3 long years was finally over. The town doctor arrived an hour later, summoned by neighbors who'd heard the gunshots. He found Silas with a broken leg and ribs, conscious but defeated. The 3 men who'd fled were arrested before they reached the main road, their reputations in ruins along with their courage. Rebecca sat in the barn with Dusty, her hand resting on his neck as the authorities sorted through the mess. The old horse was exhausted, his breathing still labored, but his eyes held a peace she'd never seen before. He'd done what he needed to do. "That horse saved your life," Sheriff Morrison said, removing his hat as he approached them. "Saved you from things worse than death, from what I can piece together." Rebecca nodded, unable to find words for what Dusty had done. "How do you explain that a broken-down old horse had taught you that courage isn't about being fearless, but about refusing to let fear stop you from protecting what matters?" "What happens now?" she asked. "Well," the sheriff said thoughtfully, "you're 16, old enough to choose your own path, especially given the circumstances. Got any family willing to take you in?" Rebecca shook her head, but for the first time, The thought of being alone didn't terrify her. She had learned something in that barn. That family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about finding someone willing to stand between you and the darkness. "I'd like to stay," she said quietly. "Someone needs to take care of the horses." Sheriff Morrison smiled. "Ranch needs a caretaker anyway now that Silas won't be running it. You think you and your friend here are up for the job?" Dusty nickered softly, and Rebecca could have sworn she heard approval in the sound. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the same spot where she'd almost lost everything, but now the barn was clean and well-maintained, the horses healthy and content. Dusty grazed peacefully in the pasture, his coat shining in the morning sun. The old stallion had earned his rest, but he still kept watch over Rebecca like a guardian angel with 4 legs and a graying mane. Visitors to the ranch always commented on their bond, how the horse seemed to understand her every mood, how she could calm him with just a touch. What they didn't know was that both had been saved by the same thing, the discovery that even in the darkest moments, love can make the impossible happen, that courage grows strongest when you have someone worth protecting, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who've been overlooked, underestimated, and written off by everyone else. Rebecca had found her family in an old horse who refused to let her face the world alone. And Dusty had found his purpose in a girl who saw past his age and weakness to the heart of a protector that still beat strong and true. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Together they'd proven that the most powerful force in the world isn't strength or speed or youth. It's the willingness to stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, no matter the cost. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with courage so fierce it'll make your heart pound and a bond so deep you'll never forget it. Click on the video now.
An old man collapsed on a frosty morning, his final breath fading before help could arrive. No sirens, no crowds. Just a quiet farewell from a life once lived at full speed, once feared by criminals and honored by his brothers in blue. But someone else remembered. A retired K9, once his partner in 100 battles, now broken and gray, crossed 60 miles alone through forest, storm, and snow. No leash, no command, just loyalty. What that dog did next left everyone speechless. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you love heartwarming stories about brave, loyal dogs, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of magic. Now settle in. Today's story is about duty, love, and the kind of goodbye that only a dog can give. The wind whispered through the pines that clung to the rolling hills of Cedar Ridge, a quiet mountain town tucked away in western Montana. It was late autumn, and the chill had already begun to creep in from the north. Frost laced the edges of every fence post and window pane, and the sun struggled to warm the rooftops of wooden cabins nestled along winding gravel roads. Life here was unhurried, wrapped in the rhythm of nature and the scent of pine sap, wood smoke, and damp earth. At the far end of a gravel path, perched on a gentle slope overlooking a narrow valley, stood a sturdy log cabin with a wraparound porch, 2 rocking chairs, and a modest American flag swaying from the post. Inside lived Walter Brooks, a 72-year-old man whose presence carried the weight of history and honor. He stood 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered but thinned by age, with silver hair neatly combed back and sharp blue eyes that still burned with the intensity of a much younger man. His gait had slowed, and arthritis had claimed his knees, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice or the discipline in his movements. To most in Cedar Ridge, Walter was just a quiet, polite old man who volunteered at church and handed out fresh vegetables on weekends. But to those who had served in the force, he was Iron Hawk, a legendary figure in Montana law enforcement. His name had once sent tremors through criminal networks across the Northwest. With a mind wired for deduction and a heart tempered by fire, Walter had led dozens of high-stakes operations during his 35 years in service. His intuition in reading a crime scene was uncanny, and his reputation was forged in blood, grit, and unwavering moral code. At his side through much of that journey had been Sergeant Duke, a German Shepherd K9 officer with deep sable fur, alert amber eyes, and a drive that matched Walter's own. Duke had been trained in narcotics detection, tracking, and suspect apprehension. The bond between man and dog had been immediate and unbreakable. Together, they'd dismantled drug rings, tracked fugitives through forests, and protected countless lives. But time, ever merciless, had slowed them both. After a near-fatal gunfight in a remote warehouse 10 years ago, Walter had taken a bullet that nicked his lung. Duke had dragged him out before backup arrived. Walter survived, barely. That incident, combined with Helen's declining health, led him to retirement. Duke, whose joints had begun to stiffen with age, was transferred to a nearby K-9 retirement and training center outside Butte, about 60 miles away. It was a decision that broke Walter's heart quietly, though he never once said it aloud. Helen, his wife of 48 years, was a soft-spoken woman with warm gray eyes, gentle hands, and a subtle strength that had anchored Walter through war, grief, and duty. Petite and slightly hunched from age, she moved slowly, but with purpose. Years earlier, she'd suffered a major heart attack, followed by valve replacement surgery. Since then, Walter had become her daily caregiver, managing her meals, medications, and the subtle emotional balance that comes with living beside the echo of mortality. Despite the shadow of aging, Walter hadn't surrendered to stillness. In the backyard behind the cabin, he tended a modest garden rows of kale, carrots, potatoes, and winter squash, grown not for profit but for charity. Every Saturday morning, he loaded the produce into the back of his rusted Ford pickup and drove it to Cedar Grace Church, where he quietly dropped it off at the food pantry without ever staying for thanks. He didn't need recognition. Doing good, he believed, was its own reward. Helen, though often confined to the indoors, remained observant. She kept a small leather-bound notebook tucked beside her knitting basket, in which she recorded Walter's acts of kindness. She labeled them Walter's Farewell Journal, not out of morbid sentiment, but as a tribute to a man she believed deserved to be remembered for more than his badge. "You're not just handing out carrots," she once said gently, as Walter set a box down by the door. "You're planting legacy, one small deed at a time." That morning, a low fog curled along the tree line beyond the cabin. Walter stood on the porch in his flannel shirt and denim jacket, sipping coffee from a steel mug. His eyes scanned the horizon as if expecting an old adversary to rise from the hills. Instead, he saw deer tracks in the frost and heard the distant caw of crows. He turned when the screen door creaked behind him. Helen stepped out slowly, wrapped in a shawl, her thin fingers curled around a ceramic cup. "You're up early again," she said, her voice soft as the mist. "Habit dies hard," Walter replied with a wry smile. 30 years of waking before dawn to catch bad guys leaves a mark." They stood together for a while in silence. Then Helen spoke again. "Have you thought about visiting Duke?" Walter's jaw clenched slightly. "Every day," he admitted. "But part of me thinks he's better off not seeing how slow I've gotten." Helen touched his hand gently. "That dog never cared about how fast you were, just that you were there." He looked down, eyes glistening. "Maybe soon." That afternoon, Walter carried a box of produce down to the truck, stacking it beside jars of jam Helen had made. As he passed the small framed photo by the door, a picture of him and Duke in uniform, both younger, both proud. He paused, pressing his hand lightly to the glass. Outside, the sun had begun to pierce the fog, casting long golden rays through the trees. The smell of pine grew stronger. Somewhere, miles away, in a fenced facility nestled near Butte, Duke lifted his head sharply, ears twitching, as if he'd sensed something shifting in the wind. The next morning brought with it a stillness that was almost sacred. Thin layers of frost clung to the windows of Walter's truck, and the sun struggled to break through a bank of low-lying clouds that had settled over Cedar Ridge. It was Sunday, a day that for many in town meant church and potluck dinners, but for Walter Brooks, it meant something quieter, something older. He stood at the edge of Green Hollow Cemetery, boots crunching softly over the frost-hardened ground. He wore his old patrol jacket faded navy, the patches worn thin but lovingly preserved. A simple bouquet of wildflowers rested in his gloved hands. The crisp wind blew gently against his face as he walked between rows of headstones, stopping in front of one with the name Captain Morris D. Jensen etched in clean granite. Morris had been his first commanding officer, a broad-shouldered man with a heavy Texan accent and a fierce loyalty to his men. They'd worked countless cases together during the late 80s, before the war on drugs turned local policing into a battlefield. Morris had been like a second father, always gruff but fiercely protective. Walter knelt beside the grave and laid the flowers down. "You'd have liked Helen's carrot soup last night," he murmured, "and I've still got the badge you gave me before your retirement. Funny thing, it weighs heavier now than it did then." Behind him, the pine trees swayed. The wind didn't answer, but Walter didn't expect it to. He stayed there for a while longer, then made his way across the cemetery, stopping at 3 more graves to fellow detectives lost in a stakeout gone wrong, and 1 canine handler who died in an explosion alongside his partner dog. At each headstone, he whispered stories, jokes, regrets. These visits weren't routine, they were rituals. That afternoon, back at the cabin, Helen sat near the hearth, reading from a weathered copy of Pilgrim's Progress. The room smelled of firewood, cinnamon tea, and the faint aroma of wool drying over the radiator. She looked up as Walter entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. "How are the boys today?" she asked gently. "Quiet," Walter replied, easing himself into the chair across from her. "Though I swear Morris gave me a look about the tie I wore." She chuckled. "He was always fussy about presentation." Walter nodded, smiling faintly. "I miss the mission, Helen, the purpose. Some days it feels like the badge is still in my pocket, like I should be briefing the team." "And Duke?" she asked after a moment. Walter's face grew still. "He's the only one who remembers it all the way I do. No edits, no exaggerations, just the truth. He never needed me to explain anything, just looked at me and he knew." Upstairs, a door creaked open, and the soft thud of socks on wood followed. Their 17-year-old granddaughter, Lindsay, emerged from the narrow hallway, her auburn hair tied back in a messy bun, a worn flannel shirt hanging loosely over leggings. She was tall for her age, with intelligent eyes framed by wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of quiet demeanor that often went unnoticed in loud rooms. Lindsay had moved in just 2 weeks prior, her world upended by her parents' bitter divorce. She carried herself with the cautious stillness of someone who'd heard too many arguments and spent too many nights waiting for a door to slam. Yet in the silence of Cedar Ridge, she was slowly beginning to breathe again. "Grandpa," she asked as she tiptoed into the living room, "can I ask you something?" Walter sat up straighter. "Of course, kiddo. I found your photo album, the one from the academy, and all the newspaper clippings in the old metal box. You were kind of a big deal." Walter scratched the back of his neck, sheepish. "I suppose I was," he said, glancing at Helen, who smiled behind her tea. "And Duke," Lindsay added. "He was in almost every picture. You two looked unstoppable." "We were," Walter said simply. "For a while." There was a pause. Then Lindsay walked over, pulling a small notebook from the pocket of her oversized cardigan. "I was thinking, what if I wrote down your stories? You know, the real ones. Not just about cases, but about what it felt like. About Duke. I could make it a book. For your birthday." Walter blinked, surprised. "A book?" She nodded, suddenly nervous. "I mean, you don't have to help, but I think people would want to know about you. About the things you did." He leaned forward, voice low and steady. "Lindsay, the things I did, they weren't always clean. There were nights I came home covered in mud, blood, and doubt. Some of those stories never had an ending. All the more reason to tell them," she said, holding her notebook close. "Even the hard ones." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but if we're doing this, we're doing it right. No superheroes, just people, and one hell of a dog." That night, after dinner, Lindsay sat by the fire with her notebook open, listening intently as Walter began to speak. He told her about the warehouse raid in Missoula, the moment Duke found the missing girl behind a false wall, the time they slept in a snowstorm on the trail of a meth runner. His voice was calm, deliberate, and full of texture like worn leather that still held its strength. Helen watched them from across the room, heart swelling with pride. Outside, the wind blew steady through the trees, and far away beneath the stars, a retired German shepherd stirred in his sleep, ears twitching to a memory only he could understand. The morning in Cedar Ridge arrived with a harsh stillness. The wind cut across the valley like a warning, and a layer of fine snow blanketed the wooden roofs and gravel roads. Trees stood bare, their skeletal limbs trembling in the cold. Walter Brooks had been up since before the light. He moved slowly but deliberately through the kitchen, loading winter vegetables into a worn wooden crate, each motion a ritual etched into his bones. "I wish you'd let me go instead," Helen said softly from the doorway. She wore a pale flannel robe, her frame wrapped in a heavy wool shawl. Her breath hung in the cold air, her hands trembling ever so slightly from arthritis and years of careful living. Walter smiled, that old half-crooked grin that still had a trace of the iron hawk in it. "I'm not ready to trade my boots for that rocking chair just yet." "You already earned your rest, you know," she said, watching him button his coat. He turned, lifting the crate into the truck bed with a grunt. "The Clancys are scraping by. I've got food, wheels, and a good back at least for now. That's enough." The Clancy family lived in a sagging trailer near the base of Mount Kessler, tucked between two dried-up creeks. After Kevin Clancy's fatal accident at the lumber mill last year, his wife Marla Clancy, a lean woman in her 40s with a sharp jaw and tired eyes, had been working every shift she could find at the Cedar Ridge Diner. She had 2 sons, both under 10, and barely enough heat to keep the frost from settling on their walls. Walter had made it his quiet mission to deliver what he could: vegetables, firewood, coats left behind at the VFW hall. Walter swung the driver's side door open and paused. A sudden pressure pressed deep in his chest, not sharp, but immense, like something inside was being wrung out. He blinked against it. His breath came shallow. "Just the cold," he muttered and reached for the handle again. The second wave hit harder. It gripped his left side and collapsed him to the earth like a felled tree. His body crumpled on the frosty gravel, the crate of vegetables toppling beside him, squash rolling loose into the snow. Helen, still by the front window folding dish towels, saw him fall. She dropped everything and flew out the door in her slippers. "Walter!" She knelt beside him, pressing her hands to his face, already pale and clammy. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." Inside the cabin, she scrambled to the hallway and snatched the landline receiver from its hook. Her voice shook as she spoke to the dispatcher. 911, what's your emergency?" came the calm voice of Erica Lang, the county's lead operator, known for her even tone and steady hands in chaos. She was in her mid-30s, with auburn curls tied back in a functional bun, and a reputation for never raising her voice. "It's my husband," Helen cried. "He's collapsed outside. I think it's his heart." "Ma'am, help is on the way. Stay on the line. Can you keep him warm?" Helen dropped the phone and rushed back out, dragging the thick wool blanket from the porch bench and tucking it around Walter's shoulders. She kept whispering his name, over and over, as though she could will his heart to keep beating. 60 miles away, at a snow-covered K-9 retirement center near Butte, the sky was bright but bitter. Inside a reinforced kennel near the back of the facility, Sergeant Duke stirred from a restless sleep. His sable fur had dulled with age, and his once powerful gait had slowed to a steady limp, but his ears still picked up the faintest changes in wind and tone. That morning, something changed. Duke jerked upright, his ears pinned forward, eyes locked on the far wall. A strange electric intensity gripped him. He began to pace, then to whine. A handler walking by stopped. "Hey boy, easy," called Jack Mullins, the head trainer. Jack was in his early 40s, a former Army K-9 handler with a broad chest, weather-beaten face, and a quiet authority that came from years of silent service. His buzz-cut blonde hair peeked from under a fleece-lined cap, and his denim jacket bore a patch from his old unit. Duke didn't respond to Jack's voice. He let out a sudden bark, a high, sharp sound full of urgency, and threw his body against the gate. Once, twice. The third time, the latch snapped. The door flew open. "Whoa, Duke!" But the old German shepherd didn't wait. He bolted through the open walkway, across the snowy field, and toward the forest that bordered the center. His body moved stiffly at first, but within seconds he had found his rhythm nose low, legs pumping. Something deep inside him was calling. Jack and his assistant Emily Carter, a tall, freckled trainer in her early 30s, with a love for senior dogs and a habit of talking to them like children, sprinted after him. "You ever seen him move like that?" she shouted. "Not in 5 years," Jack said, panting. "Whatever it is, he's not just running, he's going back." Back in Cedar Ridge, the ambulance pulled up in record time. Tom Riley, a grizzled paramedic with crow's feet and a thick gray beard, led the charge. He moved fast, flanked by Kelly Adams, a young paramedic with a focused calm and steady hands. "He's fading," Tom said after a quick check. "We need to move now." Helen's hand gripped Walter's until the very last second. "Don't you dare go without me," she whispered into his ear. The doors slammed shut. the siren wailed. As the vehicle disappeared into the distance, the cold wind blew stronger, sweeping across the snow-covered hills. Far away, Duke ran, ears flattened, breath rising in puffs, eyes unblinking. His paws left shallow prints in the snow, but his purpose left a deeper trail, one the earth itself seemed to follow. The waiting room at Missoula County Hospital was bathed in sterile fluorescent light, too bright and too silent. The clock on the wall ticked with the indifference only time could afford, each second stretching longer than the last. Helen sat, hunched in a padded chair, too large for her frame, her hands clenched around a thermos of tea that had long gone cold. Lindsay sat beside her, silent, with her hoodie drawn up over her auburn hair, and her fingers anxiously picking at the notebook in her lap. The door finally opened. Dr. Jason Fuller, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and rectangular glasses perched on a tired face, stepped into the room. He was tall, slightly stooped from years of bending over hospital beds, and wore the kind of quiet seriousness that people instinctively trusted. Helen stood immediately. "Doctor?" Fuller hesitated for only a moment before speaking, his voice low and steady. "We did everything we could, but the heart attack was severe. His system was already weakened. I'm so sorry. Walter didn't make it." The room froze. Helen didn't cry. She simply nodded, her face pale, then slowly sank back into her chair as if her legs had forgotten how to stand. Lindsay looked to her grandmother, lips trembling. She reached over and held her hand. The world outside the window kept moving, cars passing, clouds shifting. But inside the waiting room, time stopped for 2 generations of a family that had just lost its anchor. 2 days later, Cedar Ridge was shrouded in the gray quiet of late winter. A soft snow fell, blanketing porches and hedgerows in muted white. The town had always been small, but in grief, it felt even smaller, more intimate. Word of Walter Brooks' passing had traveled quickly. Flags were lowered, porch lights glowed longer. Men took off their hats as they passed the Brooks cabin out of instinct. Helen stood in the center of Cedar Grace Church, her hands clasped in front of her. The small wooden chapel sat on a hill just past the town square, with tall windows facing the mountains and simple wooden pews that creaked when you shifted. Reverend Allen Hartley, a balding man in his 60s with a gentle face and slow speech, stood beside her, going over the funeral program. He had known Walter for nearly 30 years, first as a young pastor just out of seminary, then as a friend. "He always liked things simple," Helen said, her voice hoarse. "And dignified," Reverend Hartley nodded. "We'll do right by him." They arranged for a plain oak casket, a single folded flag to rest upon it, and a photograph of Walter in his prime, a shot from 1992, taken after the Jackson County drug bust, where he stood tall in uniform beside a young Duke, both looking straight into the camera with equal intensity. The townsfolk responded in full. By that evening, Helen had received casseroles, letters, handmade cards, and phone calls from nearly every corner of the county. Former officers from other towns reached out, some who'd served with Walter, others who only knew him by reputation. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Lindsay took it upon herself to help with the arrangements. One afternoon, while packing up her grandfather's things, she opened the old trunk at the foot of his bed. Inside, she found badge numbers, commendation plaques, and beneath them, a dusty camcorder. She plugged it into the TV, her curiosity overriding the dust and decades. The screen flickered. There was Walter, younger, more upright. He stood in a field beside a cabin that looked like it belonged to another century. His voice came through, gravelly but warm. "This was our last run together," he said to the camera. "Me and Duke, 32 degrees, meth lab in the basement, suspect armed, but he didn't hesitate, never did." The camera turned slightly, revealing Duke alert, tail wagging, eyes locked on Walter with that fierce canine focus. Walter knelt beside him and pulled the dog close. "Good boy. My partner. My shadow." Then the video ended. Lindsay sat still, eyes stinging. That night, she uploaded the video to her small social media account with a caption that read, "This was my grandfather and the dog who never left his side. Thank you, Officer Brooks, and thank you, Sergeant Duke." She went to bed without thinking more of it. By morning, the video had reached 12,000 views. By the afternoon, 85,000. Comments poured in. "We need more men like him. I served with Duke's trainer. These dogs are heroes. My dad knew Walter, said he once took a bullet for a civilian. People from every corner of the country began sharing the video, tagging old precincts, K-9 units, veterans groups. The image of Walter holding Duke, the silent understanding between man and dog, struck something deeper than words. Lindsay showed Helen the response. Her grandmother sat in the recliner, hand to her mouth, tears forming in eyes that had remained dry for days. "He was always so quiet about his service," Helen whispered. "He never wanted a medal, just to do good." Lindsay nodded. "I think people finally see him now." The preparations for the funeral continued. Uniformed officers volunteered to stand honor guard. A young bugler from the local high school offered to play taps. And all the while, far beyond Cedar Ridge, through forests and ridgelines, something stirred in the snow still moving, still searching. Snow blanketed the town of Cedar Ridge that morning, soft and unyielding, muffling footsteps and quieting engines. Cedar Grace Church, perched on its familiar hill, was almost unrecognizable beneath a veil of white. Its tall windows flickered with candlelight as people filed in, shoulders dusted with snow, hearts heavy with silence. Inside, the church was filled to capacity. The pews overflowed with townsfolk, former officers, and strangers drawn by something unspoken. They came not just for Walter Brooks, but for the legacy he left behind, one built not with medals, but with quiet integrity, steady courage, and a fierce, unwavering loyalty. At the front of the sanctuary, Walter's casket rested beneath the American flag. A folded police uniform sat beside it, neatly pressed, untouched since the day he retired. Next to the casket stood a framed photograph from 1992. Walter in uniform, younger and upright. A strong hand resting on the back of a German shepherd with eyes that mirrored his own. Duke. Helen sat in the front pew, wrapped in a navy coat and long black gloves, a silver brooch shaped like an eagle pinned to her collar. Her face was pale and composed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Next to her, Lindsay clutched her notebook against her chest, the pages filled with stories not yet read aloud. Reverend Alan Hartley cleared his throat as he stepped to the pulpit. His voice, always measured, echoed softly through the church. "Walter Brooks was a man who never asked to be seen," he began, "but today we see him. Not just for the badge he wore, but for the life he lived, and the lives he touched," he continued, reciting the verses Walter had once underlined in his Bible. The room remained still until a sound broke the silence. A single ragged bark rang out from the back of the church. Heads turned. At the threshold stood a German shepherd, soaked through, his fur caked with frost and mud. His body was gaunt, legs trembling, but his eyes, his sharp amber eyes, were clear. They were locked on the casket. A ripple of gasps passed through the congregation. The shepherd stepped forward, limping down the center aisle. Each step echoed against the wooden floor, each one more uncertain than the last. Snowmelt dripped from his paws. His breathing was shallow, but determined. No one moved to stop him. They watched, spellbound, as the old K-9 approached the front of the church. Helen's breath caught in her throat. "My God," she whispered. "Duke." The dog halted before the casket. He looked up at it for a long, suspended moment, then lowered himself to the floor beside it. With a slow, deliberate motion, he rested his head gently against the polished wood. The entire room fell silent. No one coughed, no one whispered. Even the snow outside seemed to still. Reverend Hartley, who had paused mid-sermon, closed his Bible slowly. "No words I could offer," he said quietly, "would ever speak louder than what we've just witnessed." In the third pew, Officer Brent Keller stood in uniform, his hand to his heart. Brent, a man of calm bearing and a strong build, had served under Walter decades ago. He had driven 3 hours through snowfall from the neighboring Flathead County just to pay his respects. And now, as he watched the aging dog press against the casket, his eyes shone with tears. By then, the video Lindsay had posted, the one of Walter and Duke on their last mission, had reached over 500,000 views. The story had spread like wildfire across social media. Officers from as far as Texas and Colorado commented on the post, tagging their departments. Retired veterans wrote tributes. Families who'd never met Walter sent flowers to Cedar Ridge. Lindsay, overwhelmed, had turned off her notifications after the 10th media request, but she had read every comment. One in particular stood out. "He saved my brother's life in 1997. He never said a word about it, just shook our hands and disappeared. This man deserves the world. Now here was Duke covered in snow and grief lying like a silent monument beside the man who had once called him partner. Helen slowly rose from her seat, walked toward the casket, and knelt beside the old shepherd. She placed her trembling hand on his fur, cold and wet from the storm. "You came home," she whispered. Duke didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence was answer enough. The service continued around him. People rose to speak, one by one. Former partners, childhood friends, even a young woman Walter had pulled from a crash when she was 12. Each voice carried a fragment of a man whose impact could no longer be measured in years or badges. But Duke didn't move. He stayed where he was, loyal to the last breath of a bond forged in duty and sealed in love. The snow had stopped by the time the last hymn faded into silence, but the air inside Cedar Grace Church remained heavy. Like the building itself understood it was witnessing something sacred. Duke still lay motionless beside Walter's casket. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths, and his wet fur soaked into the wooden floor. His eyes, glassy and rimmed with tears, never wavered from the polished oak lid. He didn't whine, didn't bark. He simply stayed. Not a soul in the church dared to speak. Helen sat motionless in the front pew, one hand clutching the folded flag, the other resting on her lap, palm upward, almost as if it waited to hold something that would never return. Lindsay had stopped taking notes altogether, her pen resting between folded hands. Even Reverend Hartley, still at the pulpit, remained quiet, eyes on the dog, as though the sermon had found its true preacher. Then, from the fourth pew on the left, a man slowly stood. He was tall and slightly stooped, with a trimmed white beard and the sort of sun-worn skin that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His eyes were dark, thoughtful, and deeply lined at the corners. He wore a gray trench coat over a simple black suit, and on the lapel sat a bronze sheriff's pin, dulled by age. The man cleared his throat. "If I may," he said. Reverend Hartley gave a gentle nod. "Of course, Bill." Bill Monroe, a retired sheriff from Carbon County, had driven from the southern edge of Montana for the service. He was known in the law enforcement community for being strict but fair, and had built a reputation as a dependable, no-nonsense officer. Walter had once called him the rock in the storm, a man you could trust when everything went to hell. Bill walked to the front of the sanctuary and stopped beside Duke. His voice, though weathered, carried easily. "I've known Walter Brooks for over 40 years. We met during a joint operation across state lines. He was younger than I was, but had a steadiness that made everyone else feel steadier too. He never sought the spotlight, but he always showed up when it counted." He looked down at Duke, who had lifted his head ever so slightly, as if recognizing the voice. "What most of you don't know," Bill continued, "is that this dog Duke saved my life." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "It was 15 years ago," Bill said. "I was chasing a suspect through the woods north of Missoula. The guy was armed, cornered, and desperate. I'd slipped down a ridge, dislocated my shoulder, and couldn't reach my radio. The suspect had his sights on me." He paused. And then Duke appeared, just him. No handler in sight, no backup. He didn't growl, he didn't leap. He positioned himself between me and the barrel of that rifle and stood like stone. Long enough for Walter to catch up and end it without bloodshed. Bill looked at Helen. "Your husband never told anyone, not a word. I only ever got to thank him once, and he shrugged it off, like it was nothing." He turned to Lindsay. "Young lady, if you're writing a book about your grandfather, please write that down. Let the world know what silence sometimes hides." The congregation remained frozen. Even those who didn't know Walter well now understood that his quietness wasn't emptiness. It was integrity. As Bill sat down, Helen reached over and touched Duke's back. "He remembered," she whispered. "Even when Walter didn't want the praise, Duke kept the story." In the days that followed, condolences poured in from every direction. Letters, messages, and emails arrived not only from police departments, but from the hearts of everyday people. Among them was a simple manila envelope postmarked from Cedar Ridge Elementary School. Inside was a bundle of handwritten letters from third graders, folded construction paper with crooked hearts, hand-drawn badges, and large block letters written in crayon. One read, "Thank you, Mr. Walter, for telling us stories about being brave and kind. I want to be like you when I grow up." Another, "My mom says heroes wear capes, but I think they wear boots and have dogs like Duke." The envelope had been sent by Ms. Teresa Abbott, a fourth-grade teacher with graying blonde hair, always tied in a tight bun, and reading glasses perpetually perched on the tip of her nose. She had invited Walter to speak to her class 2 years ago for Career Week. He had shown up in his old uniform and brought photos of Duke, captivating the room with stories of quiet courage and teamwork. Walter didn't just talk about catching bad guys, Ms. Abbott had written in the cover letter. He talked about protecting people, about choosing kindness over anger. He said that anyone could be strong, but not everyone chose to be good. That left a mark on my students that has never faded. Helen placed the letters in a small wooden box beside Walter's medals and the folded flag. Lindsay added the envelope to her grandfather's story in the manuscript she was building, one quiet page at a time. And in the sanctuary of Cedar Grace, Duke still lay beside the altar. Church staff brought him blankets, visitors, flowers. Someone even brought a bowl of water and fresh meat from the deli. But Duke didn't eat. He barely drank. He simply stayed, still and silent, guarding the space where Walter had last rested. As the sun set through the tall windows, golden light bathed the old shepherd's frame. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. He remained as Walter had trained him, devoted, vigilant, waiting for the next command that would never come. The air had turned brittle by midday, the kind of chill that seeps into the bones and lingers in the breath. Snow dusted the branches of the birch trees that stood tall and silent along the edge of the small Everbrook Cemetery, just a mile beyond Cedar Ridge's main road. Their white trunks shimmered under a pale winter sun, their slender limbs reaching skyward like quiet witnesses to the passing of time. This was the place Walter had once pointed to from the hilltop during a spring walk with Helen, long before illness, long before Duke's muzzle had turned gray. "If it's not too much trouble," he had said then, "I wouldn't mind resting here. Something about these trees feels honest." And so, on that crisp afternoon, the procession arrived. The hearse moved slowly down the narrow path that curved through the birch grove. Helen followed in the first car, sitting straight despite the weight in her chest, her gloved hands folded tightly around a white lily. Beside her, Lindsay held the memory box with Walter's badge, his folded flag, and the letters from the school children. Behind them, a line of cars trailed quietly, neighbors, old colleagues, distant friends, and walking behind the hearse, at a slow, determined pace, was Duke. No leash, no command. Just the instinct that had always guided him. His paws crunched gently through the snow, his limbs trembling from age and exhaustion, but his eyes focused, unblinking. A faded bandana, once worn on duty, was loosely tied around his neck, Lindsay's idea that morning. He should look like a partner again, she had said. They reached the clearing. A small team of volunteers, including Tom Dillard, a stocky man in his 60s with kind eyes and a voice that rumbled like an old pickup, had prepared the burial site just beneath Walter's favorite tree, a tall birch with a split in its trunk that resembled a quiet smile. Tom had been one of Walter's hunting buddies in the early 90s, though Walter hadn't touched a rifle since retirement. The casket was carried gently from the hearse by 6 pallbearers, 3 active officers, 2 old colleagues, and Brent Keller. They set it down above the open grave with reverence. Helen stepped forward, kissed her fingertips, and touched the wooden lid. Duke approached next. His nails tapped against the earth as he stood beside the casket. He looked up at the box. His ears twitched, then settled. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to draw from the furthest corner of his chest, he let out a low, guttural growl, not of anger or warning, but of farewell. It was soft, almost like a sigh, but with something primal and sacred buried inside. The sound hung in the air like a final note, echoing gently through the birch trees. No one moved. Helen wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered, "He's letting go." Reverend Hartley stepped forward and offered a closing prayer, his voice nearly drowned by the soft wind rustling through the leaves above. As the final words faded, the casket was slowly lowered into the earth. Lindsay gently placed a sprig of rosemary on top. "For remembrance," she whispered, and Duke stood motionless, watching until the last inch of wood disappeared beneath the soil. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to drift away, Helen lingered. Tom Dillard approached her, removing his cap respectfully. "If you ever need anything, Helen, I mean anything, you just call." She smiled faintly. "Thank you, Tom, truly." Back at the cabin, silence greeted her like an old friend. The fireplace had been left burning low, and the scent of cedar logs lingered in the air. Lindsay helped her out of her coat and disappeared to put on tea. Helen walked slowly to the back porch and looked out over the garden, now barren, covered in snow. The rows where Walter had planted potatoes and squash stood quiet, save for a single wooden trellis still standing. That night, she made a decision. The next morning, Helen called in a favor from Susan Keyes, a local woodworker in her 50s, broad-shouldered with steel-gray hair always tied in a bun, known for her steady hands and no-nonsense demeanor. Susan had once built the dining table in the Brooks home, simple, strong, and made from a fallen maple. "I need a sign," Helen said. "One that'll last." "Words?" Susan asked. Helen nodded. "Just this. Live like Walter, full and quiet." Susan placed a hand over her heart. "I'll get to work." Within days, a small memorial garden took shape in the backyard. Helen and Lindsay cleared away the wilted vines and snow-heavy branches. They planted lavender and rosemary in the corners. A bench was placed under the old elm tree. And in the center, the wooden plaque was staked into the soil. It read, "Live like Walter, full and quiet." Neighbors stopped by to visit. Some left stones, others left poems. Duke, when not sleeping beside the fire, would often wander out there, nose twitching, tail still. One afternoon, Lindsay brought out her grandfather's notebook and sat on the bench reading the pages he had written long before he stopped putting pen to paper. On one page was a simple line, "Loyalty doesn't bark, it stays, even when it hurts." She smiled and wrote that quote in her own journal, circling it twice. The days that followed the funeral slipped by like early snowmelt, quiet, unannounced, and bittersweet. The town of Cedar Ridge moved on, as small towns must, but at the edge of the birch grove, in a house that still held the scent of old leather, black coffee, and cedar smoke, time moved differently. There, in a weathered cabin tucked between frost-laced pines, Walter Brooks was both gone and everywhere. Helen moved gently through the space they had once shared, her steps slower now, not just from age but from the weight of absence. She no longer reached for a second cup when she brewed coffee in the morning, but she still poured it out of habit, letting the steam curl upward in memory. And Duke old, gray-muzzled, loyal as sunrise stayed. After the service, he had refused to leave Walter's side in the church. They'd let him sleep there that night, curled beneath the altar like a statue carved by grief. The next morning, Helen came to bring him home. She didn't call, she didn't leash him. She simply opened the back door of the truck and waited. Duke had climbed in without hesitation. Now he belonged to her, not by command, but by continuation. And she never once tried to restrain or retrain him. Walter's legacy had shaped the dog's instincts too deeply to undo. He moved through the cabin like a ghost made flesh, sleeping beside Walter's old chair, checking the perimeter twice a day, and every evening, like clockwork, climbing the 3 wooden steps to the front porch, where he'd sit for hours, eyes fixed across the snowy valley toward the birch grove where his partner now lay. Neighbors continued to stop by. They came with stories instead of condolences, now stories about Walter pulling cars from ditches during blizzards, building shelves at the library without being asked, or showing up on porches with bags of groceries when no one knew they were needed. One visitor, a lanky man in his 30s named Sean Willoughby, wore a faded sheriff's department sweatshirt and brought with him a canvas bag filled with sketch pads. "I used to draw in the back of his truck when I was a foster kid," he said, sheepish, cheeks flushed with cold and emotion. "He said drawing kept the mind clean. That's why I joined the academy, ma'am. He made being a cop look like art." Helen had invited him to stay for tea. Duke sat beside her the whole time, tail curled around his front paws, eyes blinking slowly, like he remembered Sean too. Inside the cabin, upstairs in the loft room that had once stored old holiday decorations and forgotten fishing gear, Lindsay had transformed the space into her writing nook. A desk salvaged from the basement now sat beneath the window. An electric kettle, stacks of research books, and dozens of notebooks lined the shelves. And on the far wall, pinned beside her favorite quote, was the very first printed copy of her grandfather's story, The Last Patrol. It was a slim, soft-cover book, just under 200 pages, with a simple black and white photo on the front. Walter in uniform, Duke at his side, both staring down the lens with an intensity that asked the reader to lean closer. The dedication read, for those who serve and the dogs who never leave. Lindsay had worked night after night, fueled by old interviews, dusty notes, and Helen's quiet encouragement. When the manuscript was ready, she'd sent it to a small Montana-based press run by Kara Winslow, a fiery, petite woman in her early 40s, with cropped red hair and a laugh like summer rain. Kara had once been an investigative reporter in Missoula before she traded headlines for handmade books. She read the manuscript in a single night and called Lindsay the next morning. "It's not a biography," she said. "It's a prayer disguised as memory. We'll print it, no question." The first print run was 500 copies, small, focused, personal. Lindsay insisted they be given away for free. "Not sold," she told Kara. "Just sent. To police departments, K-9 handlers, veterans' homes, animal shelters, anyone who needs to know what loyalty looks like." They shipped them with handwritten notes tucked inside each package. Word spread fast. Within weeks, readers began writing back. Letters from retired officers in Florida, military wives in Arizona, a 10-year-old boy in Ohio who just lost his dog and said Walter and Duke's story helped him be brave without barking. Some of the letters made Helen cry, others made her laugh. But they all reminded her of one thing. Walter's story didn't end with his funeral. It had only just begun. Then came the idea that changed everything. It started as a comment and email from a K-9 handler in Billings. "I wish every retired K-9 had a place like Walter's porch." That line stuck with Lindsay. She wrote it down, circled it, stared at it until the snow outside blurred into gray. That evening, she sat beside Helen, mug in hand, and said, "What if they did?" And so was born Sergeant Duke's Home, a non-profit shelter and rehabilitation haven for retired K-9 dogs, named not after Walter, but after the four-legged partner who had refused to leave his side. Helen loved the idea. "He would have liked that," she said, nodding. "He always thought Duke deserved the parade." They converted Walter's old workshop on the property into the pilot space. Volunteers helped clear it out, adding heating pads, ramps, and vet supplies. A retired vet tech named Linda Groves, a stout woman with laugh lines and a contagious optimism, offered her weekends. A GoFundMe campaign, launched quietly by Lindsay, exceeded its goal within 48 hours. And Duke, he remained the soul of the place. Every visitor, every new dog that arrived, first met Duke on the porch. He was old now, moving slower, breathing harder, but his presence calmed even the most anxious arrivals. Somehow, even the new rescues seemed to understand. They were stepping into sacred ground. One evening, as the sun set behind the ridge and golden light soaked the valley, Lindsay sat with Duke on the steps. Her manuscript, now worn and marked with fingerprints, rested in her lap. She scratched behind his ears and whispered, "You did it, Sergeant. You came home." Duke didn't move. He just leaned into her hand, eyes half closed, tail flicking once like a period at the end of a perfect sentence. We don't get to choose where our story begins, but we do get to choose who walks beside us as it continues. Sergeant Duke was more than a dog. He was memory wrapped in fur, a sentinel for what we often forget, that loyalty doesn't fade with age and love doesn't vanish when a voice goes silent. In guarding Walter's porch, he guarded something greater, reminding us that some bonds aren't broken by death, only deepened by it. Through his quiet watch, he lit a path for others, for the forgotten, the retired, the ones who served in silence. His presence turned grief into legacy, and a simple cabin in Montana into a sanctuary of second chances. Maybe you know a Duke, maybe you've loved someone the world didn't see, but you never forgot. Let this be your reminder to honor them, to remember, to pass it on. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this again. Share it with someone who still believes in quiet heroes. And may God bless you and all those who wait at the window, faithful as ever, until someone comes home.